Hi guys, it's a little weird to not be actually up in front of you, but thank you nevertheless for joining me for this session. It's going to be pretty hard to follow up those sessions from Lonnie and Sophia, but I will do my best. My teaching thing is about distance, spacing, and setting in your story, whether that's large scale uh, maps and the environment and the world your characters are moving through, or smaller scale, a room or a house for a specific scene. We're going to kind of go through what to do, what not to do, what are some sort of pitfalls that I've come across in the past, and what are some strategies that I found out that have really helped me. Okay, so a little history and background on why I landed on this for my presentation topic. First and foremost is I have a passion for maps, and especially the fantasy maps that you find in the inside book covers of fantasy books. I probably spent hours as a kid looking at the map inside of Aragon, and I really think maps like that add a depth to the world and the world building of your story um, for readers. And so at first I considered a course on map making, how to make realistic terrain, and what sort of things to consider when you're building your world. But I wanted this presentation to be applicable to writers of all genres, whether your story takes place in a city or in our world or a fantasy world. I wanted to cover things that you need to consider and you should hopefully be able to find helpful regardless of your genre. So, objectives for this module. First, we want you to learn strategies to keep your world feeling consistent and realistic. There are few things that bother me more than finding inconsistencies and poor logic in a story setting. Things that pull the reader out of the story because they start to kind of question the logic of the situation. Likewise, though, one of the most boring things to read is a paragraph describing dimensions. So we want to develop writing skills that convey scope and space without bogging down the narrative. If you've ever read the book of Leviticus, you know that chapters and chapters of dimensions might let you construct a pretty accurate tabernacle, but it makes for pretty poor fiction reading. And so, lastly, I also want you to understand that breaking the rules is fine. You can have mountains that disobey the laws of physics. You can kind of break the rules that you've even set yourself earlier in the narrative, so long as you understand why and you do it in a way that enhances the story rather than kind of breaking the logic. All right, so first is the big spaces. This is the city or country or even just a house in which your story takes place. It is the whole thing. And so the first thing that you should do is know the physical scope of your story. Know whether your story takes place on the Isle of Manhattan or an entire fantasy continent. Um, and then know a little bit about that space. So if your story takes place in a city, know the main streets, know the cool statues and landmarks, because if your city is real, even if your readers haven't been there, it adds a depth and a grounding to your story to be able to reference those details. And if your story isn't real, likewise, just including those things that the characters would know, even if the readers don't, adds that depth of world building and setting to your story. And so, one of the things that you want to make sure that you don't do is whether your story takes place in a real world city or a fantasy one or a whole fantasy continent, what you want to avoid is having your reader get pulled out of the story by saying, wait a minute, that can't happen. Oftentimes, this has to do with timing, a character leaving the store or the conversation, leaving to go to the store at the start of a conversation and already being back by the end. Unless your characters live right next to the store, that seems unusual. It sends up a little flag of unreality for your reader. Um, if your story takes place in a real city, make sure you know the distances well enough that they don't travel 10 miles in 10 minutes, unless they have the ability to do that. And if your setting is fantastical, make sure you, well, to my next point, stay consistent. If your characters in chapter one take an hour to walk from the harbor to the capital, that had better still be the case in chapter 10. If times start fluctuating, readers are going to notice, and it's going to seem like you're just having these distances morph for your own convenience. An example of someone who did this well is Nicola Yoon in the book The Sun is Also a Star. In the story, the two protagonists go all over Manhattan over the course of the day. And the timing makes sense as far as distances they have to travel, means of transport they use. And the fact that they're having to do this traveling and there's sort of a ticking clock in place actually heightens the suspense because you're wanting them to accomplish their goals, but distances are factored into account. An example, technically, of not staying consistent is the show Avatar The Last Airbender. Because in season one, it takes 20 episodes and weeks of time to make a journey that crosses the globe, basically. In the finale, characters make that journey twice in the course of a few hours. Um, and so the rule of consistency was broken, but I would argue that that's an example of doing it well, and we'll get to that later. Lastly, if you are designing your own landscape, your own world, your own city, what have you, do some research into how terrains form, into what's reasonable for the kind of world you're building. I love to bash on the map for the Lord of the Rings because mountains don't form right angles ever naturally. And likewise, rivers don't flow through mountain ranges because to do so they would have to go uphill. Now, if your reason for doing that, like if you want a river that crosses a mountain range in your story, you can do that. But now you've got a river that's flowing uphill, and so you've got a magical river. And that's cool because that's an interesting landmark to have in your world. And you can keep that, just know that it's unusual. And let your characters either know that it's unusual or refer to it as the magic river. All right, so the small spaces. This is your setting for an individual scene. And in those kind of smaller spaces, uh, distances and spacing either matters a lot or not at all, and usually not at all. And the reason that I say that is because it's one of those things that should almost always be shown rather than told. Um, for example, how big was Harry Potter's cupboard under the stairs? Small, right? J.K. Rowling never needed to give us the dimensions of it. She just described it as cramped and small and a cupboard under the stairs. We can picture that. Same thing with the wardrobe in Chronicles of Narnia. We don't know how deep the wardrobe was supposed to be, but what we do know is that when Lucy expected to feel the back of the wardrobe, she didn't. That's an experience that readers can understand and can imagine far more than they can understand and imagine numbers and measurements. And that's largely because people, on average, are really bad with exact measurements, or picturing them at least. Have you ever read a story that went, I went outside and was hit with a blast of 2-degree Fahrenheit wind? It's impersonal. It's a sure way to pull a reader from the story. Measurements, measurements of spaces are impersonal, experiences of spaces are personal. Um, and that's what you want to convey. You want to give the sense of the setting so that your reader can imagine it and feel themselves there. But dimensions can be very important if they're plot relevant. Say, for example, your protagonist is a character on the high school track and field team. And try as she might, she can't get a long jump distance farther than 14 feet 2 inches. Uh, it's a big deal for her. Now, fast forward into the story, and her little brother is on the other side of a chasm that the villain has just proclaimed to be 15 feet across. Now you have drama and suspense and a challenge for your character to overcome. Uh, you can give these, you can give numbers to your readers so long as the readers can care about them, and then they're important. And so that's my take on describing spaces, but why necessarily include that in a presentation related to maps? And it's because, again, you want to make sure that your setting makes sense. And your characters aren't just solving their problems through plot magic. So to my point of a building or structure should never have features ex machina, um, in my thesis, I have an escape scene. My characters are on a ship and they need to get off. They're down in kind of the dungeon hold at the bottom of it. And in an early version of this escape, I had a trap door that led up into a storage room, basically. But there was no reason for that trapdoor to be there. It made no sense. It was just a convenient way to get my characters out without killing them. Um, and I really had to rework that. I had to kind of map out the ship, figure out what was all there, and think, all right, so what are the villains doing to make sure my protagonists aren't escaping? And then had to make sure my characters were solving this problem and getting out and being ingenious. Uh, and it made the scene more suspenseful. It gave the characters more agency, and overall just made the writing stronger. All that to say, you want to make sure that you have a good picture of your setting, that it makes sense, um, and that you're letting your characters and their actions sort of drive the scene and its description to the reader. Alrighty, so breaking the rules. I've kind of told you what to do and what not to do, but as in all things writing, there's an excuse around the rule. So first, if you're going to break a rule, don't draw attention to it by poorly explaining it away. When I was talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender before and how they kind of fudged distances, the reason it was fine is because they didn't try and explain it to us. They didn't come up with an excuse for how it was suddenly possible. They needed something to happen for the plot. They let the fudge happen, and I have yet to meet another viewer who even noticed, much less cared. Uh, so a bad excuse makes the mistake worse, not better. Just avoid that. That said, it's fine to break the rules. The whole point of an MFA is learning the rules of fiction writing so that we can break them with style. Uh, Likewise, with the rules of distance and logic, if you're going to break them, you should know how to do it and why you're doing it. So, uh, if you're breaking the rules, one strategy is to make your characters aware of it. If something's happening that shouldn't, remember that your characters are smart, and it's a great way to foreshadow. So if your characters are racing to the Colosseum in Rome and the bad guy beats them there and they have no idea how, it sets up a pretty gratifying reveal later on when your characters realize the series of tunnels running beneath the city. If you don't do that, though, You can let your readers, but not your characters, be aware of when rules are broken. Um, if you set up some sort of rule or law early in the narrative and then break that rule later on, even if your characters aren't aware of it, your readers probably will be. Which leads me to my last point of whatever you do, don't break trust. Your most readers can handle an irrational decision or two or a little thing getting fudged. But if you keep throwing nonsensical things at them without explanation, eventually they're going to get frustrated. You want to hold to the rules that you set for yourself, or else the reader's no longer gonna know what matters, what doesn't, and whether the characters are even aware of things being different than they should be. When it comes to building a world, like I mentioned earlier, if you want square-shaped mountains or rivers flowing uphill, that is fine. Do it. Just have a reason for it. All right, I'm over time here, so I'll wrap this up quickly. The instructions for the writing exercise are coming next, so just stick around for that. But for now, thank you for sitting through this with me, and I want to leave you with the parting remark that unless you're working within a place that already exists, but even then, remember that you're the god of this world. So don't let these rules that I've kind of put in place for you hinder your decision making or your creativity. Uh, if your characters need to get to the other side of a mountain range and you can't figure out how to get them to do it in time, remember that you can just take that mountain range away. Uh, if your characters are struggling to get to the train station on time, the train can leave later. So don't trap yourself in your own world. And remember that the world is yours, your writing is yours, and have fun writing. All right, so the writing exercise. The instructions for this are in the handout that I gave you, but I wanted to go over it in person too. There are two kind of halves to this exercise, so keep that in mind as you're sort of pacing yourself. The first thing that I want you to do is think of a scene in your story, or invent one now, where the spacing of it matters. This could be an escape scene, like the one in my thesis that I told you about. It could be a car chase. It could be someone hiding from the bad guy in a sort of horror scene, whatever you want. And then briefly, 60 seconds or so, map out the dimensions of that space. You can give actual excuse me, measurements if you want to, or just sort of draw it out. Whatever takes it from where it is in your mind to the page, and is something that you can reference as you go on through the exercise. Once that's done, I want you to write out the scene or a portion of the scene taking 8 or so minutes, uh, and take extra care to actually give the dimensions involved. So if your characters are moving down a hall, tell me in numbers how long the hall is. If it's in a room, give me the width by length measurements of it. And I know that this is flying in the face of everything that I just told you, but we're going to get to that because once you're done with this first half of the exercise, I want you to rewrite the scene, or since you're probably doing this on Word, edit the scene, um, and remove all of those measurements. Take out the numbers, take out uh, anything that I basically just spent 15 minutes telling you not to include. But continue to show the actions, the crawling, the hiding, the running, the stabbing, whatever. And use those actions and point of view as well to convey the spaces, either the confines of the small room or the length of the hall and how it just seems endless. Uh, and then once that's done, and you're about at the end of the 15 minutes that this whole exercise should take, think about what made the second scene better, if it was better. What did you find could be cut, and did planning and mapping out the space beforehand help? If so, great. I hope you can use this in future writing, and if not, I hope that you manage to pick up at least some sort of strategy to use in the future. But for now, with that being said, happy writing.